and welcome to our roundtable discussion today on multiculturalism in practice, the Ukrainian-Canadian experience. My name is Balan. I'm the director of the Kule Ukrainian-Canadian Studies Center at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. I should just want to begin by acknowledging that even though our event is online, it is taking place mostly in Canada. And I do want to acknowledge the fact that we are the beneficiaries of the Native people sharing the land with us. I couldn't help thinking earlier that maybe it's time to change the Canadian words to the Canadian national anthem from our home and native land to our home on native land, which would be a more accurate description. Anyways, just a few remarks by way of introduction. CIUS has been engaged in multicultural politics virtually since its inception. Our founding director, Dr. Manoli Lupul, of course, was very active in multicultural politics beginning in the early 70s. Our institute was founded in 1946 and has been involved in a number of multicultural initiatives over the course of its history. So this is a continuation of that work. We did host a session on multiculturalism and the impact of multiculturalism on public education in March, which you can watch online. And we will be also hosting a roundtable on multiculturalism, then and now, thoughts from the perspective of 50 years on May 28th. That's going to be as part of the Congress of Social Sciences and Humanities. And unfortunately, you have to be registered as a Congress participant to be able to access it live or live stream it. But we will be recording it, and it will also be available online. Finally, CIUS will be hosting a conference in November 12th to the 14th, called Reconciling Multiculturalism in Today's Canada. If you go to our website, you'll be able to find more information on it. Now, the purpose of today's discussion is to get people who were active in implementing multiculturalism policies. I mean, it's one thing, the session on the 28th will focus on student activists as the multiculturalism movement was gaining steam and got recognition. This is looking a little bit later down the road at actually how these, the lofty ideals of multiculturalism got translated into policies by people who are activists in or from the Ukrainian-Canadian community. We have 4 participants today. They include Bill Balan from Winnipeg, Natalka Chomiak, who's joining us from Winnipeg, Bhutan Cortana, who's on from Saskatoon, and Meron Spoyski, who's joining from Ukraine, from Kyiv. Also with us is Thomas Premak, who is working on a book on multiculturalism, and we'll ask him to share some of his observations at the conclusion of our discussion. I've asked all of our participants to speak about 10 minutes about their engagement in multicultural policies in practice as an introduction to explain where they're coming from. I'm not going to give a lot of introduction to each individual. I expect them to do that in their remarks. And then afterwards, we will have a kind of a discussion between the roundtable participants on issues of multiculturalism, how they look at them from the perspective of today. So our audience members will be welcome to submit questions using the Q&A function. If we have time, we will take a few questions as well at the end of the session. So thank you again for joining us today, and let us move now to our presenters. Our first presenter is Bill Bohdan, who happens to be related to me. He's my older brother, but who was involved in government for his professional career, and very much involved with multiculturalism from that end. So Vasiliu, I turn the microphone over to you, and if you could share some of your perspectives, that would be great.
Okay, thank you very much. So together with my colleagues on this panel and many others, I spent the late 60s and most of 70s in student organizations working and promoting multiculturalism. However, in 1978, I was able to join the federal government in the Department of Secretary of State. And I served in the federal government until 2006. So and all the way through the multiculturalism program in my area in Manitoba, Saskatchewan in the north was part of the mandate that my responsibilities included. However, in joining in 1978, the Department of Secretary of State, which no longer exists, the Department of Secretary of State was tasked with the responsibility of implementing the multiculturalism program when it was established in 71 and actually became a program in 72 with funding. So I joined, first of all, as a very, very junior officer in the department, and then moved into becoming the multiculturalism officer for quite a few years, about 5 or 6 years, and so on. Now, one thing I should mention, for those that aren't familiar with the way government works, that was a golden era of government, and in the sense that the operations in the Department of Secretary of State were highly decentralized. In other words, regional managers across the country had a lot of authority of making local decisions reflecting local needs, right down to recruiting officers to run the various programs. Secretary of State managed programs in human rights, in the women's program, in First Nations, especially Métis, official languages, which was a major one. And all of these were, like I said, highly decentralized. In fact, the recruitment of the management by the management team of the staff, and this not just in Manitoba, but right across the country, they were looking for people that were very well acquainted with the communities that they were serving. So if you wanted a person to deliver the official languages program, they took people from the Francophone community that were active in the Francophone community. And the same, women's program, multi. Now, so multi, at that time, multi had a different definition. It was, largely led by the initiatives that leading up to the 70s by the Ukrainian community and some of the other ethnic groups. But the Ukrainians were a major part of the leadership of that whole era. And so therefore, being of Ukrainian origin, one of the factors that they considered in recruiting me as a junior person was my close connection and knowledge of the Ukrainian community. So I joined the department, and within a couple of, I guess about 6 or 7 months, I became the multiculturalism officer for Manitoba. Now, the political context is extremely important because that was in 78 when I joined. We were about 1 year away from a federal election in which the Trudeau Liberals lost and the Joe Clark Conservatives won. And so there was a change. Being a bureaucrat at that time, I didn't really notice much because Clark was there for 7 months and it wasn't enough to get up ahead of steam to make many changes. So the inertia that was there before kind of continued along. Of course, Trudeau returns, the Liberals return, a year later, and he appoints, when I joined the department, it was Norm Kaffik was the Minister of Multiculturalism, the Minister of State for Multiculturalism, who, by the way, was the first Ukrainian Minister of State for Multiculturalism, but he was the fourth in the line of those. Then it was Steve Poplawski under Clark, and then it was Jim Fleming in the second term of Pierre Elliott Trudeau as the Minister of Multiculturalism. More importantly was the role that the bureaucracy played in Ottawa in setting the national policy. And so lo and behold, in 1977, after 2 or 3 ventures in the federal Department of Secretary of State, Orest Krulak returns to Ottawa in 77 and serves as the director until about 81. Very critical period of time. So, I'll be touching on some of the points there. In Manitoba, when I joined, it was Sterling Lyon, the Conservatives were in leadership, and that lasted for a couple of years. Now, what I want to talk about basically is the Ukrainian bilingual program and its origins in Manitoba. But one should realize that that decade between about a little bit more than a decade, about 14 years, from 74 to about 88 was a very critical decade in the area of multiculturalism where Ukrainian leadership was throughout. 74, the Ukrainian program starts in Alberta. In 79 in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And then you have in 81 was the creation of the the Prairie Regional Committee for Ukrainian Community Development Committee, which lasted about 5 years. Then you have the repatriation of the Canadian Constitution in 82. Major role that was played by the Ukrainian community in a national scene. Then we have in 83, the constitutional debates in Manitoba in terms of establishing Manitoba as an official language province, in which the Ukrainian community played a major leadership role. And primarily Meron Spoyski was on this panel and Natalka in the front, and I was behind the scenes as a bureaucrat. And then, of course, kind of finishing it all off, the Multiculturalism Act in 1988, that kind of those 14 years. Now, so I want to focus in, and I'm not going to spend too much time because there's a lot of details, but I want to focus in on the establishment of the Ukrainian bilingual program in Manitoba. No secret here, Peter Savarin was a major influence. Of course, he was politically the one that put it into Alberta. He influenced the Ukrainian community through the Professional Business Club in Manitoba to meet with Sterling Lyon. Very strong conservative was Savarin, and of course the P's and B's had a lot of conservative members. They met with Lyon in 79 in the spring, and you have almost an immediate decision that he approved it, so that you had a very quick response from the provincial government that they were going to approve amending the Public School Act, allowing a partial immersion program where up to 50% of the teaching time could be taught in a language other than English or French. And so that amendment was passed in 1978. I mentioned that they met in 79, they met in 78, and that amendment received royal assent in July of 1978. So by the fall of 78, the Minister of Education in Manitoba announced a pilot program in 3 school divisions. The pilot allowed some funding for those school divisions that the provincial government was putting in. And so it took a few months, but the school divisions agreed to participate. But the issue of recruiting the students into the program was left to the community. And so this was something that our community was not necessarily prepared for at that time. Working in the Sex States Department, I was able to assist in getting student grants so we could hire 3 students for the summer. And the students did the recruitment, phoning all of the churches and community organizations to locate young children that would be going into grade 1 or kindergarten or grade 1. Anyways, that was a very productive exercise. And in that fall, there was enough recruitment done in those 3 school divisions to launch them. More importantly, as the community activity started in terms of recruiting, there was interest in other school divisions. And so 2 other school divisions, the parents that organized, and one of them, Seven Oaks, the school division, agreed to offer the program even though they were not going to get funding from the provincial government. The other one, there was not quite enough enrollment, recruitment done, and so River East didn't offer it. So in the fall of '79, you had the 4 school divisions, 3 of them part of the pilot, 1 of them that weren't, that launched, and there was about 120 students enrolled, all of them in grade 1, except there was 1 kindergarten class as well. Now, behind the scenes, all of this was coordinated by the P's and B's, Ukrainian Professional Business Club, and they had initially a steering committee. That steering committee kind of evolved over the year into the Ukrainian English Bilingual Program Committee, and which functioned for about 2 years. And that kind of provided the overall leadership and oversight of any activities that were going on. I'm going to take it up to in June of 1980. The decision was made by everybody that the whole thing should be, flipped over, and that the parents' committees should take over in running the program. And so in June of 1980, the Manitoba Parents for Ukrainian Education was formed, and it exists to this day. And so I think at that point I'm going to stop. There was a lot of funding that was required during this period, and being in the Department of Secretary of State in a regional environment with the support of my regional manager, the Department of Secretary of State was a major funder throughout for the community initiatives in these 3 years. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vasilyu. Our next presenter, Meron Spoyski, I think dovetails nicely with this. He was in the community and then inside government, so he sort of worked 2 hats at different stages and was involved in some of the things that were already referred to in Bill's presentation. So, Meron, the mic is yours.
Thanks. Well, I came to Winnipeg out of Toronto, out of a very traditional Ukrainian emigre family in Toronto, and did the whole Ukrainian shtick of Ukrainian school plast, and ended up in Susk, which became a turning point because we were dealing, of course, with issues of multiculturalism in a practical way, community development, activism, changing the face of the community. And I went to work in Winnipeg for the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, as it was then called, as the Deputy Executive Director. And in stark contrast to my Susk existence, I went into a very aged organization with very limited contact with the actual community. And it was basically, Kule was then based very much on the 2 emigre political parties and the 2 lay organizations of the churches, and age-wise was far beyond sort of the normal age of the community. Had very little, it really did not reflect the nature of the Ukrainian community. In about a year, I moved over to the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center, Oseredok, as administrative director. And we started launching interesting programs at that stage. I was still watching the bilingual program, and I was hearing about Sovereign's discussions with his premier and then with Lion and the political debates. But Oseredok was starting to develop, and we lobbied ourselves to start receiving annual funding from the provincial government and from the city government, much like any other museum in Manitoba, major museum. And we were starting to be considered within that framework. And those are major changes. And about that time, when I was at Oseredok, the business group that was involved in organizing the bilingual program started holding meetings at Oseredok. And that's where my involvement with the bilingual program started in many ways. One of the interesting points there was that at some stage, somebody on the board of Oseredok found out that the bilingual committee was meeting there, and they asked me whether that was in the best interest of Oseredok to have this provocative group meeting at Oseredok, and how it would jeopardize the future funding of Oseredok. And that's an issue I'll come back to later, is how the community perceived us, the traditional community perceived us on those issues. I think that there was a major division developing in the community, in the very traditional community, and this new sector of the community that represented a very new dimension for the traditional community. These are people who didn't necessarily go to church, to Ukrainian church, who may not have been Ukrainian speaking, and had different views on issues within the community. And as we started organizing the bilingual program and that first student project that we had, we realized that wasn't enough, that we had to actually get the parents involved in approaching the school boards and lobbying the issues and in organizing themselves. And that's one of the changes that we had was we basically took our Spolsky experience and said, okay, how did we do this when we were trying to do whatever crazy things we were doing in Spolsky? We took the parents and said, okay, we got to go door to door, basically, in the regions around the school. And in fact, we had in West Kildonan, Jean, do you remember Vasil?
Yeah, Jean Cusco.
Jean Cusco actually did that. She went door to door organizing parents, and that's how she got the program going there. And we ran into people who emerged out of all these parents to eventually take over and create this Manitoba Parents for Ukrainian Education, who became community activists and in many ways. And that was an important growth for us in the community. That represented a major change in how they approached the issues. These are people who were comfortable, completely comfortable with their identities and comfortable in being who they are. The program grew and we developed into Dauphin, which was a major highlight for us. We, because of urbanization, we couldn't do it in places like Gardenton or Vida, which would have been natural, but there simply were not enough Ukrainians living there to develop the program. Or, for example, in the Stewartburn region, Shoal Lake and those places, there just simply weren't enough people who were interested in the program. And we are also going into their uncomfortable zone, which is another issue I'll discuss. We did have issues with the Ridna Shkola system. There was conflict there because the Ridna Shkola system felt that we were stealing students from them. And they couldn't understand how it was that we were going to help them grow further. I'm not sure that we actually helped them. How many of the kids in the bilingual program ended up going to Ridna Shkola on Saturdays to take a different program, but we also didn't have too many kids who were in the Ridna Shkola, who were Ukrainian speaking plus Sum, the traditional community, going into the bilingual program. We were dealing with a very different community. And in the case of the Winnipeg School Division at Ralph Brown School, we were dealing with a multicultural classroom. We were dealing with Filipino kids and non-Ukrainian kids who were joining the bilingual program for various reasons. The response we got from the two Ukrainian churches was interesting because we had the full and unconditional support of the two metropolitans. And I think we developed a very close relationship with both Metropolitan Maxim and Vasil Fedak of the Orthodox Church. And by and large, most of the parishes supported, when we were going outside of Winnipeg, were supporting what we were doing. And certainly in Winnipeg, the various parishes were supporting what we were doing. The other issue was our intercultural activity, which became clear, as Vasil mentioned. We started working closely with the Mennonite community and in their organizing of the program, and with the Jewish community. And that led to the creation of the Manitoba Parents for Bilingual Education, which was probably a nominal organization, but we exchanged ideas. And we then, in Manitoba 23, the debate on the French language issue, became the people who organized the group called Manitoba 23. Why did we go into Manitoba 23? In part, it was because those politicians who were opposed to the law being passed to recognize French as an official language of Manitoba were using the minority communities as their reason. Well, you know, Ukrainians are opposed to this. Well, you know, the Mennonites are opposed, etc. And our response was, who gives you the right to speak on behalf of the Ukrainian community? You're neither Ukrainian, nor are you part of the community, nor do you represent our community as such. That led us into a fairly interesting phenomenon where I think probably for the first time, Vasily, you might correct me, we were starting to deal in a tit for tat kind of thing. Yes, we minority community support the law on the French language, but we have needs, and these are our needs at this point. And the negotiations continued in a fairly interesting way. I remember the discussions, and I remember that restaurant on Sargent Avenue that we used to use for those evenings. And the discussions went on that way, and that was another new feature, because the discussions, I think, and the positions we took were uncompromising. We said, these are our requirements, this is what we need, and this is how we need it. Which, again, after my year at Cook, was different, because there they would compromise. Well, you know, the government, I don't want to put them in a bad position. I don't want to put myself in a bad position, so we'll take what the government says. That was not the case here. This is our position. This is what we want. And that's how we ended up with the funding, I think, for the Ukrainian Community Development Committee. I don't think that, other than Manoli Lupol's book on his memories on the development of multiculturalism, that enough credit is given to the work that was done by the group in Alberta to set up the bilingual program, and then in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and then the lead into UCDC. And the work that was done to start bringing in the other sectors of the community into the community, back into the community. We had thousands of kids in Ukrainian dance, not represented anywhere in the community. We had people in choirs, not represented anywhere. They had no source of information, and no source for resources other than the goodwill of the conductors and the leaders of those groups. And suddenly we were trying to create the environment in which they could function and have the resources and the ability to develop and exchange ideas. I think that's reflected in some ways in the Alberta Council for the Ukrainian Arts. I think the other issue that we should focus on or discuss and need to look at is that UCDC, in developing the vision and strategy paper, which is called Building the Future Ukrainians in the 21st Century, did work that had not been done previously. We said, we are Ukrainian Canadians. We have played a particular role in the development of Canada. Our role is crucial to Canada's growth. In some respects, Canada would not have occurred in the way that it did without the participation of Ukrainian Canadians. And we have nowhere to go, unlike any other ethnic group. And if you read the first section of that, that's stated very clear, and that identifies our particular place and role in Canada. In some ways, we were copying, I'm running over time here. Okay, give me a second, I'll finish. In some ways, we were copying what the French had said in the Heirs of Lord Durham, in their report that had come out about 10 years earlier. Let me just, I think, so those were sort of the success points of that. It led to the integration of Ukrainians, I think, symbols into Canadian society, and we see that virtually every day. I follow Canadian news, from Winnipeg and Edmonton and Toronto, and you see that in regular news. The political aspect, getting people to run for school boards and going there, and I think that was important. And changing the face of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress that needs to continue changing at this stage. And I'll stop there and we'll discuss more later.
Thank you, Meron, and just want to take advantage of your reference to Manoli Lupo's book, Politics of Multiculturalism, to insert a commercial message in this program. The book is available from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. You can order it online, or you can now download it for free online. So I highly recommend it. And Manoli, of course, and Peter Savarin, who was mentioned earlier as well, he wrote a memoir where he talks a lot about his involvement in multiculturalism. And we also have, oh, there it is. Thank you, Alexander. The activities in multiculturalism realm by, of course, Paul Yuzik have been documented, as have J.B. Rudnitsky's, there's Isidore Hlenka, Walter Ternopolsky. A lot of people went into creating the policy of multiculturalism. Our focus, of course, is on the application or implementation of multiculturalism policies. And on that note, I will turn to Natalka Chomiak, who was on the ground in the trenches doing multicultural work, especially in connection with the bilingual school program. Natalka.
Well, thank you, Yars, and a big greeting to all of our audience who are following this on Facebook and later on YouTube. I was very touched when Yars asked me to be part of this panel. I cannot say that I, was there when the bullets were flying, like Bill and Meron. And I would say that they took the brunt of the first, rushes across out of the trenches and into the battlefield during that really critical period. When the bilingual program and real political change was initiated by the group around the Ukrainian Community Development Committee, KUK, the bilingual program. I came to a place where the battles had largely been fought and the battles had largely been won. I found it very interesting to be asked to be on this panel because I think the panel is very timely. It's surprising to me, but perhaps it shouldn't be surprising, that we are living through a time when multiculturalism is, in the grand scheme of things, once again, a thing that is being discussed and that is being contested globally. I think that we as Ukrainian Canadians who came from being a minority in an imperial setting and then immigrating into a new country and being faced with being a minority in what was then, the waning days of an imperial set of relationships, brought a particular set of insights into the question of minority rights and minority linguistic rights. And I think that today we have something to say to a larger global audience. So I think that discussions of multiculturalism are very much on the order of the day. And I think that we as a community have something to give from our own experience in that process. When I was preparing for this panel, I was reading through some of our old position papers, newspapers, essays that were written in response to the launching of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. And I must say that I was struck by how fresh some of that very early discussion and debate was. I think, I was surprised at how much emphasis the early student debates placed on equality and equity in the Canadian political system. And so I thought that the debate there was, was interesting. I was surprised by the paper that was produced by the Ukrainian student organization at the University of Manitoba, and how clear they were about the experience of Aboriginal communities in the Canadian setting, and what we as Ukrainian Canadians, what kind of responsibilities we had, and what we could bring to a larger discussion around diversity in our country. I was interested also at some of the policies that I think, policy discussions that I think were, pointed a way, a road untaken. So for example, one of the things that Andriy Mochuk in his discussions focused on was on social policy. He, for example, talked about kindergartens, daycare. He talked about supports for single parent families. He talked about a community that was undergoing, like the rest of Canadian society, a massive structural change. And I would say that if you want to understand multicultural policy, I think we should understand that Canada was going through a tectonic shift. There was a technological revolution that was taking place. There was a cultural and economic revolution that was taking place. And we find ourselves 50 years later grappling with issues of equity and equality. We are grappling with issues of identity. And again, I think that our experience as students and then as leaders, I would say, as I would say that Bill and Meron, for example, provided real leadership in the prairie Canadian setting around a lot of these issues. I would say that if we look back in terms of a big picture on multicultural policy and leadership from the Ukrainian community, I would say that there is much that we can be really proud of. I think that if we look at larger multicultural policy debates globally, what is interesting about Canada is that even though we have real tensions around unit of the kind of we do not have the kind of burdens that are being grappled with to the south, that our American neighbors are struggling with. And I think that our multiculturalism efforts, for example, have led to a really much more tolerant, diverse society than our southern neighbors. It's interesting to read the fear that is mobilized around multilingualism in the States, for example, around Spanish-speaking communities attempting to utilize their language in the American arena. I think that the sting was removed in that kind of debate here in Canada. I would say that we should be very proud that the Ukrainian bilingual program still exists here in Manitoba. I think it is an underutilized resource. And I think where we have fallen down is that governments don't understand the value that was brought with that type of programming. In the same way, I think that, one of the things that I was really very interested in was how multiculturalism was mainstreamed in Winnipeg. So, for example, what happened was that there was an institutional response to the leadership efforts that were brought from the community. And we had things like the groundbreaking 500 years of Ukrainian art at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, which I think brought in a whole new audience for the Winnipeg Art Gallery, but also was a real cultural event for our community and for other communities in the city. I think that the musical programming that contained a Ukrainian element that the Winnipeg Symphony, for example, was programming, was another sort of example of that kind of mainstreaming of Ukrainian content into Canadian institutional structures. And it's something that I think that we should continue to try and press forward. I think that supporting the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies was a very smart investment on the part of the Alberta government. And they were not caught flat-footed when in 1991, Ukraine announced its independence. I mean, when you have that kind of body of expertise, it is valuable for the country as a whole. And I worry, for example, at this moment that Canadians don't understand what a valuable resource they have. It is a real intellectual legacy of that multicultural movement. The other thing that I would like to say before I stop speaking is that I think that I really stand in awe of all of the Ukrainians who worked to bring about living, breathing human rights legislation into the Canadian polity. And Ukrainians had a really important role in all of that. What I think was a problem was that we talked about individual rights, we talked about community rights, but that sort of discussion around community rights, I don't think that made it out into the larger Canadian discussion. So I think that we should be very proud of the work that was done around human rights legislation. And I think that we did broaden sort of cultural understanding, intercommunity, foster really good relations between diverse communities. But I don't think that Canadians have a good grasp of the need and the what can I say, dynamics of group identity. Or broader community identity. So I guess I will leave it at that and leave it for the other panelists to talk a bit more about their experiences in this particular field.
Thank you, Natalka. And just to pick up on something you mentioned, obviously multiculturalism is a big topic, especially now spanning 50 years. And you mentioned about the arts, the role of the arts. I mean, that's a whole other separate discussion. So I just want to make it clear to our audience that our focus today is somewhat narrow. It has to be because we could go all over the map, but thank you for this. And our next speaker is Dr. Bhutan Cortana, who's at the University of Saskatchewan. He's a political scientist, and he has an unusual take on multiculturalism from his own experiences. So Bohdan.
Thank you, Joris, and thank you to the audience for taking part in this particular event. I'd like to begin by saying that I'm very much sort of in awe of my panelists, and I'm pleased to be in the company of so many of them that have pushed really hard in making multiculturalism a reality in Canada. Along with them, I've been invited to give a short statement, an opening statement, reflecting on my experiences as an activist, but also as an academic working on multicultural initiatives and issues. My participation in the multicultural movement is somewhat different. In the late 1970s and 80s, I was living abroad, and so I didn't really actively participate. But what I did have, as in terms of experience, was to serve as a kind of observer and commentator on multiculturalism during the late 80s or early 80s and on into the 90s. And so that's what I will be focusing on. The theme of today's roundtable, of course, as we know, is the practice of multiculturalism, but I also believe it's how multiculturalism as policy was derailed and how the multicultural movement failed to achieve for Canada and Ukrainian Canadians. That was the promise that was set out in the original act. I'll begin by sharing two stories about my participation, insights that I gleaned from this involvement, and how from this we might understand the reality of multiculturalism and 50 years on move forward. So I'll begin with story one. In the early 1980s, as a research associate at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, I was assigned to conduct research for the Ukrainian Community Development Committee. We've already sort of identified who they are, but it was a subcommittee of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. My role there was to provide weekly analytical reports to the committee members. Research focused primarily on the 1981 census data, highlighting trends within the Ukrainian Canadian community, but also I was responsible for a survey of Ukrainian Canadians, sampling attitudes and perspectives on levels of group solidarity. The results of the research were expected, given the existing anecdotal evidence. The fortunes of the community were in decline, and the outlook of community members were pessimistic. For the UCDC, the Ukrainian Canadian Community Development Committee, the research gave substance to their claim that the government of Canada was derelict in its duty to make good on multiculturalism, which had been introduced largely a decade earlier. It further provided the needed rationale for the UCDC to create a blueprint for action, insisting that multiculturalism be supported as a context through which genuine social, economic, and political justice could be achieved. Throughout the exercise, I was struck by the insistence of the UCDC, and here I had fairly close contact with some of the sort of key individuals in Alberta. It was Lawrence Decor, Manoli Lupul, Bill Peteruchny, Bill Diachuk. I was struck by the insistence of the UCDC on treating the community as a monolithic whole, undifferentiated in its needs. It was an intentional strategy, conveying both the importance and the influence of the community. The introduction of the category multiple origin Ukrainians in the 1981 census reinforced this notion. The idea being invoked at the time was that there were 1 million plus Ukrainians in Canada who by extension were denied rights as a group. I personally felt the argument to be disingenuous and said so at the time. Contrary to the narrative of 1 million plus Ukrainians in Canada, multiple origin Ukrainians, those who considered themselves only partly Ukrainian, were not so easily defined and therefore not so readily subsumed in a single category. They did not belong to traditional churches. They were largely unilingual. They were overwhelmingly native born, increasingly urbanized, and worked across a variety of industries and a range of occupations. They were a cross section of the general population. Most importantly, however, they did not self-identify as single origin Ukrainians. Ukrainian was but one of the many ethnicities that encompassed their identity. The survey results were no less telling. Multiple origin Ukrainians who responded in the survey did not consider heritage, understood in the traditional sense, to be a salient factor in their daily lives. They were aware of their Ukrainian makeup, but did not see Ukrainian culture, language, or community life as central to their identity. Thus, they engaged in Easter and Christmas rituals, but found no need to regularly attend traditional church services. They did not see the point of sending their children to Ridna Shkola, although they wanted them to have some basic knowledge of language. They wanted to visit Ukraine, but were unlikely to join Ukrainian organizations. Importantly, Ukrainian identity then centered around the issue of choice, although filtered through a personal lens. Choice highlighted the manner in which multiculturalism was meaningful to them. Multiple origin Ukrainians acknowledged the relevance of multiculturalism insofar as it facilitated access to heritage and reinforced the belief that this was who they were as a people. As a matter of practice, the essential hybridity of Canadians was captured by this new spirit and understanding of multiculturalism. Several insights can be gleaned from this. First, to be meaningful, multicultural concerns have to be tied to personal narratives of growth and development. Second, as a political strategy, group rights, the underpinnings of multiculturalism, have to be tied to the issue of individual rights. In both cases, the guiding principle is for ethnocultural communities to be supported so that individuals might enjoy the right of exit and entrance within the culture on their own terms. That's what the data shows. Without this prospect, individuals are denied the right to define themselves in ways that they find personally meaningful. Multiculturalism, in this sense, recognizes the importance of a people's membership in culture, enables meaningful individual choice, and supports the right to self-determination. Why is this important? The strategic direction of the community in the 1980s was to treat multiculturalism as a contested issue. The community leadership cast multiculturalism as a question of fairness and equality. This was, to be sure, both right and necessary. But by adopting adversarial position, the issue was politicized with unintended consequences. The debate was viewed as a power struggle, creating the mistaken impression that the object of the exercise was narrow group interest. We've heard some of that already from our previous speakers. By not casting the issue more broadly in the language of individual rights shared by all, an opportunity was missed to coalition build with other communities and reconnect with the majority of Ukrainian Canadians, multiple origin Ukrainians, in a way that was both more meaningful and realistic. This suggested to me at the time that community leadership did not have a firm grasp on the nature and needs of Ukrainian Canadians writ large. Furthermore, the disconnect made for an insular, if not marginal, strategy around which the larger community could not be easily rallied. I would argue in this partly lies the answer to the question, why the failure of multiculturalism? Story 2. The second narrative relates to my work as a consultant and analyst of multicultural policy at the national and provincial levels. It begins initially with my work as an advisor to something called the Canadian Ethnocultural Council, the CEC, in the 1990s, and concludes with my work as part of a Saskatchewan NDP think tank assessing the policies of the Romano-Calvert governments. In the mid-1990s, I had an opportunity to work with the CEC. At the time, the Chrétien government was poised to undertake an overhaul of the federal multicultural program. As a pan-national organization representing 33 ethnocultural communities, the CEC felt compelled to issue a rejoinder to the program's intended plan. I was asked to author the organization's response, to which I agreed. I wrote a brief that was endorsed by the CEC and presented to government. I won't go into the details except to say that the proposed program changes by the government represented a conceptual and political narrowing of the Multiculturalism Act, reconfiguring the program to fit government priorities and needs. Specifically, the government's attention focused on addressing racism. This, to be sure, was both right and just. However, the new focus was at the expense of supporting cultural diversity. In advocating for social justice, the principle of equality was thus diluted. Moreover, in the push to promote interculturalism, the meaning of the original Multiculturalism Act was upended. Why this occurred is perfectly understandable. Fighting racism is a good thing, but the government strategy was deeply flawed and even counterproductive in playing off one issue against the other. After the defeat of the Saskatchewan NDP Calvert government in 2007, several academics who identified with the provincial NDP were asked to participate in a post-mortem. Why the loss? What were the policy failures? And to suggest possible new policy directions for the party. I was tasked with reviewing and assessing provincial multicultural policy under the NDP. Again, I won't dwell on the details, but will share the primary conclusions of my contribution. Namely, the Romano-Calvert governments looked to use multiculturalism as an instrument to address economic and demographic challenges that face the province. This led to a series of initiatives on how best to harness the multicultural connection. The Romano government initially sought to use cultural ties with various homelands as a way to increase trade and commerce. This then shifted toward promoting international language acquisition, Spanish, Mandarin, German, and Russian, in public schools as a strategic priority, believing the language link could create advantages with major trading blocs and potential economic partners. Subsequently, the federal lead on anti-racism and human rights inspired the Calvert government to rework multicultural programming in order to promote societal awareness and increased institutional responsiveness to the province's indigenous peoples. Multicultural policy would then change again as part of the provincial effort to attract and retain immigrants by looking to ethnocultural communities to facilitate immigrant integration within the province's economy and social fabric. Whether at the national or provincial level, the inclination of government was to use multiculturalism as a mechanism to achieve political goals that tangentially related to cultural awareness and tolerance, but generally undercut the community development. The reduction in funding for multiculturalism during the 1990s echoed this lack of commitment. This situation is not entirely unexpected. For those who have some knowledge of the early origins of multiculturalism during World War II, the parallels between yesterday and today are striking. More to the point, the historical continuity in government practice toward ethnic communities, representing either a problem to be solved or a factor to be used, underscores official ambivalence and arguably even contempt for cultural pluralism. Is it any wonder then that the policy of multiculturalism, first introduced in 1971, was greeted with skepticism? Outside of Quebec, multiculturalism was widely interpreted as a ploy in Ottawa's gambit to diffuse the momentum of Quebecois separatism. Inside Quebec, multiculturalism was generally seen as an instrument used to minimize the charter status of francophones in the rest of Canada. From the perspective of Ottawa or within provincial government circles, multiculturalism has a role to play. Although limited, contrived, and imposed, it is one that Canada's ethnocultural communities are encouraged to accept. In this, we partially find the answer as to why multiculturalism too has failed. Multiculturalism, a reappraisal, some kind of final sort of observations. These are two stories. How do they combine and what relevance do they have for today and tomorrow's multiculturalism? The story of the community and government has been one of an adversarial relationship. Among other things, it has been a story of struggle and the fight for respect. The community's leadership has staked out a position, arguing for equality of treatment, opportunity, and justice. There's nothing wrong with this. In doing so, however, leadership has assumed a defensive posture, emphasizing the need to entrench and consolidate. The government's position, on the other hand, historically has been one of studied ambivalence or cynical maneuvering. In keeping with a liberal rights agenda, concessions, of course, have been made, but there's little in the way of unequivocal support for multiculturalism or a desire to anchor it so that it becomes part of the institutions, language, and practice of government. The two stories, therefore, are at odds. How to reconcile them? Is it even possible to reconcile the two? As someone who's been involved in working on multiculturalism and assessing it, I'm led to believe that it is possible. It's possible as both community and government come to accept a more nuanced understanding of Canada as a multicultural nation. Let me explain. I'm a firm believer in the truism that Canada is a multicultural nation, but I also believe that Canada, rooted in a liberal democratic tradition, is a civic nation. The genius of Canada is that the politics of the country reflects both discourses, a country populated by groups as well as individuals, made whole by the idea that these same individuals possess identities located in culture, heritage, and the past. Canadians are multicultural beings. How do we know this to be true? The prevalence of multiple origin Ukrainians is a testament to this fact. They choose to be multicultural, but in a way that is personally or increasingly personal. The importance of this should not be lost on the Ukrainian Canadian leadership. It is both right and good that they make the argument for increased heritage programming support for cultural retention, as well as greater recognition for the historical contribution of Canada's ethnic communities. But this must be made within the context of a liberal framework with individual choice in mind. Canadians choose their identity, selecting what is important to them in the mosaic that is Canada. Acknowledging this would be the start of a long do-over conversation on what it means to be Ukrainian Canadian. It would also allow for a better and deeper understanding of what the wider community that increasingly expresses its identity as rights-bearing individuals. In short, for multiculturalism to resonate with Ukrainian Canadians, it must do so in ways that mirror their lives and interests. But government, too, must take notice that Canadians are multicultural beings. Historically, federal and provincial governments have viewed cultural identity as a barrier to integration. Moreover, government is suspicious of multiculturalism, accepting it as useful to the degree that it can contribute to solving problems and addressing priorities. Sadly, this mindset has allowed multiculturalism to be ignored, or worse yet, to serve as a vessel for disingenuous or misplaced policies and harebrained schemes. This is unfortunate because by ignoring multiculturalism, government denies in many ways what it means to be Canadian. Critics of multiculturalism have argued that being invested in liberal democratic values, Canadians are a people defined by those values: freedom, equality, tolerance. They declare that this is who we are and aspire to be. Civic identity in this sense has been proffered as a substitute for multiculturalism. Meanwhile, Canada is depicted as the consummate civic nation. I have no quarrel with this, but as I've made the case elsewhere, I'm no closer to understanding who we are as a people. How do we differ, for instance, as a nation from those who share the same political traditions? In a globalizing world, identity predicated on liberal beliefs and values represents a vision of the postmodern world. Identity, or rather, represents a vision of the postmodern world and the end of history, a community of global citizenship. No matter how alluring the prospect, we are not there yet. We may never be. In the absence of this alternative, and given the corresponding need to carve out a place in the world, Canada is compelled to turn to the cultures, histories, and the mosaic that have shaped Canadians individually and collectively. Hence the importance of multiculturalism and why the need to support and celebrate it. It is also what in the end will oblige the government to take multiculturalism more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Bohdan. Now, Dr. Tom Primack, who's joined us, is working on a book on multiculturalism. And of course, there are lots of diverse ideas and directions taken in the conversation today. I'm wondering, Tom, if you have any general observations or any specific questions you'd like to ask to the panelists. You're muted, Tom. There you go.
Okay, can you hear now?
Yep.
Okay, firstly, I'd like to thank everybody for their presentations. They're very varied. Each is different from the other, but each contributes something. I do have some specific positions on this, on these different matters, and it comes out of my own background, and each of you has said something about your own. So I think I should say something about my own as well. Firstly, I'd like to say that I'm a Ukrainian Canadian of the third generation. I'm in my 70s now. So that means that my grandparents came to Canada before the First World War, before 1914. They're part of the pioneer immigration. And that's true both on my father's side and on my mother's side. So I guess I'm the only one on the panel of that, with that type of background. So I have a slightly different perspective than the rest of you, I believe. Now, behind much of the discussion here is the question of the origins of multiculturalism and what it means and where it's going. I'm a historian by profession, and so I study origins and where things are going. But historians, you know, people always ask them, what's the future? What's going to happen next, you know? And I always reply that historians look backward, they don't look forward. So the future is not my specialty. But I would like to say something about the origins, which I think bear upon much of the discussions today. Multiculturalism came about in Canada as a result of certain very important geopolitical changes within the country and within the world. Within Canada, there was the varied nature, the dual nature of the country, French and English. Internationally, there was the decline of the British Empire. In the 1960s, you might recall, if you're old enough, that country after country across the world was given its independence by the British or by the French, all over the world, especially in Africa and in Asia. In 1960, I believe there were 14 countries which acquired state independence. So the British Empire was on its way out. Now, this was very important for Canada because Canada was part of the British Empire, was kind of like the first daughter of the British Empire, it was often said. And if the empire is out, What does that do to Canadian identity? What does that do to the first daughter of the empire? Well, it puts it into question. And this was at question at the time. And one of the results of that was a rise of French Canadian nationalism in Quebec and Quebec nationalism. The government was faced with the splitting up of the country. It was heading in that direction. There was violence in Quebec. There were bombs placed in mailboxes, all that sort of thing. And the government felt it had to do something. So it called this Royal Commission on Bilingualism, Biculturalism. As a result of that commission, it was determined that Canada was not really bicultural. It was bilingual to some degree, but not in the way the government expected it to be. And it was certainly not bicultural. So that multiculturalism sort of grew out of those basic developments. I have an experience with multiculturalism primarily as an academic. I was a witness at the University of Toronto during the years of the establishment of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies, roughly at the same time that the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was founded at the University of Alberta. And at Toronto, just as in Alberta, there were very heated political debates about this. There was a lot of resistance to the establishment of the chair, just as there was to the Institute in Alberta. So I was a witness to all that. I wasn't a participant in any of those debates, and I didn't take positions on them, no public positions on them. But I witnessed it all, and I had feelings about it. So my experience with multiculturalism largely came about most intimately at that time. And it was a kind of a second phase in the development of multiculturalism in Canada. The first phase being the folk festivals and that sort of thing. The second phase being more higher culture with changes in museums and art galleries and in academia. And I was a witness to this second phase in the academic sphere. Now, going on from that, I would address the question of that several of you have adumbrated a bit. Has the battle been won? Is Canada really a multicultural country today? And what does that mean? Well, I have personal experience with that. When I was a young man and when I was a child, there were still some discrimination. There was a social hierarchy and there was an ethnic hierarchy in the country. And at the top of the hierarchy were the Anglo-Saxons, and to some degree, in a different way, the French. And the others all went down in that hierarchy. You know, there were the Scandinavians and the Germans and then the Slavs, and then others like other visible minorities at the very bottom. Now that had to be done away with. And I think that multiculturalism to a large degree was successful in doing away with some of that hierarchy. You can't speak of that same hierarchy in the same way today. There are vestiges of it, yes, but I think that that hierarchy has largely been smashed by the multicultural movement and by other movements for human and political rights that have occurred over the past half century. And to some degree, I would say, I would disagree with Bohdan in this respect. I would say that multiculturalism and these other movements have been very successful in Canada. And today we have much more equality. We've come a long way. And I'm thankful for that. And I'm a personal witness to it as well. Now, I'd like to just end by saying that I did not marry a Ukrainian girl, although I looked around for many when I was a young man. But I wound up marrying a girl from Iran. And I had a long experience of with the Middle East, long interest in the Middle East. And this was intensified by my marrying somebody from Iran, who was an immigrant, newcomer in the country. She had only been here a few months when I met her. So at that time, I introduced her to the concept of multiculturalism, which was totally foreign to her. And she latched onto it immediately. She understood it. It raised the status of immigrants. It raised the status of people who are not English. It raised the status of others. And she was aware of this. And this has been true throughout our many long years together. So I have personal experience of the success of this multiculturalism policy in that sphere as well. So there are many smaller questions that the speakers have raised, but I think I should stop there and throw the field open to questions from the audience. I thank you all for your attention. Thank you all once again for your presentations.
Thank you, Thomas, for your remarks. Maybe I just want to first of all give an opportunity to the roundtable participants if they have any specific issue they want to challenge or support or whatever their colleagues on the panel on, they could do so now. Otherwise, we do have a number of questions here that are quite interesting. Bill?
No, I don't have anything. I think we've discussed it at length, and I think the questions from the public would be most interesting.
All right. One question here that struck me was from Edward Baidus. Let me just find Edward's. Of course, it's not here. Edward is a interesting subject, and thank our speakers. Thank you to the speakers for sharing their thoughts on the subject. How do Ukrainian immigrants who arrived after 1991 adjust to Canadian multicultural society and policies compared to those of ethnic Ukrainians of earlier immigration waves and born here? Thank you. So for recent immigrants, of course, they hear about multiculturalism. They know that Ukrainians played some role in it, but what is it? How do they relate to it? Any observations about that from your experiences?
I have a
Meron.
concern. Oh, okay. Let Meron go.
Let me start from the Ukrainian perspective. I mean, since I've been here for 30 odd years, that immigration needs to be divided into two groups in effect, and perhaps two waves even, because the initial group that arrived were those who were leaving Ukraine at any cost. In some respects, we can call them marginals to the society, and I'm not demeaning them. I'm simply saying they were not full participants in this society. They were finding ways to get around in the Soviet society, and they have very little interest in maintaining or developing their cultural ancestry or cultural heritage. And the extent to which they participate in the Ukrainian community in Canada differs, and we see their responses on many issues. If you go on various Facebook pages, you'll see their responses. You see their participation in typical Soviet groups, the 9th of May celebrations, those kinds of things. You then have a second group, which were those who had professions that were moving to develop their professions, who have a much greater affinity for those things Ukrainian, including those from the Russian-speaking sectors of parts of Ukraine, and they tend to Ukrainianize to some extent in Canada. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Hussein?
I was going to mention, in my pastime, I'm president of a Ukrainian Orthodox parish here in Winnipeg for many years. And so in the last decade, we've seen a large wave, a large influx of Ukrainian immigrants. Our parish has been traditionally very strong with immigrants going back even before the Second World War. But there is a unique thing here about a good portion of this last group, because our parish also provides services. Our priest speaks in Russian. So there are, a large number of families that are basically Ukrainians from Russia, but are Russian speaking. And one of the fears in getting to know them, one of the fears that I have and that I've uncovered is that there's a large portion of them that live in Canada in a complete stovepipe, and the only media they watch is RT. The only source of information they have is Russian television. And so now you talk about, there's a question about integrating into the Canadian society and into even the Ukrainian society. This is a source of huge conflict because we're not working with the same information. In some respects, it models the stuff that's going on in the States with the radical right, and they have their sources of information, and integration into the general society is extremely difficult. So the issue of integration is extremely complex, especially since you have that, and these are basically good people. I'm not saying that this is bad or whatever. Our parish provides, our priest provides services, individual services, et cetera, to them. But the fact that we get into a discussion over coffee later on with people, and we're on different planets. We're absolutely on different planets. And they see not just the Ukrainian community, they see the world in a different way. So that's one comment I was going to make.
Certainly, integrating the new immigrants is a complex process that's going to take time, and it's going to be interesting to see how their worldview evolves through their integration in Canadian society. David Lupel asks, given the decline of globalization in the world economy, and given how dependent multiculturalism has been on global migration and the rise of global migration and the rise of anti-immigrant settlement in Western countries, what can we expect for the future of multiculturalism? So Tom has begged off as a historian from playing the prophet in this matter, but do you have any idea, could we maybe just go through the panel? Where do you see the future of multiculturalism in Canada? Let's keep it to Canada, not Ukraine specifically. Natalia?
Well, I don't see an end to globalization. So I find it hard to, limit the discussion to Canada. I think that globalization sort of forces us, whether we want to or not, into consideration of this process. I would say that, if we look at Canadian immigration policy, I think that Canadian immigration policy doesn't take advantage of the multicultural nature of our society. And that one of the problems with multiculturalism as it's been practiced is that it's, even though it's multicultural in name, what it is in fact promoting is a kind of melting pot strategy vis-a-vis new immigrants. And so, you bring in, for example, Sudanese refugee policy, refugee community. And in some ways, what you're telling those Sudanese refugees is to, as quickly as possible, jettison your language and culture so that you can integrate into our society. And I think that, and we have, anti-racial policies that will help you integrate. And I think that that's a mistake, because I think that what that language and culture provides those new immigrants is with a kind of series of roadmaps that help them understand where they came from, helps them cope with the trauma of war and displacement. And, I think that one of the things that would be helpful in this kind of process is a broader intercultural understanding in Canada. So for example, before this panel, I was talking to a friend and I said, well, what do you think about multiculturalism in Canada? And she was a teacher who taught in the Winnipeg school system, not in the Ukrainian bilingual program, but in the mainstream of programming. And, she said, well, mainly we talked about intercultural, we talked about multiculturalism as an intercultural process. And she said, for example, I taught a class on Shevchenko, and the response with my Filipino students and other students in the class was really positive. So in other words, we brought to Canada a very specific kind of cultural knowledge around oppression, around feudalism, around, chattel, a chattel economy. And that was something that is not within the conversation that the larger culture had any experience with, but we did. And so we had something we could talk about in terms of equality, equity, identity, economic strife. And I think that we as a country don't recognize that. And we don't understand our experiences particularly well, which takes us back to where I left. I mean, one of the politics is the art of the possible. And the Ukrainian Community Development Committee and its project was very much a project that operated within the realm of the possible. But when you establish, for example, a policy that fosters multilingualism, you have to take that multilingual cultural legacy somewhere. And so where do you take it? I think you take it into cultural production. It was not surprising to me that when we surveyed Ukrainian Canadians with, of the third generation, fourth generation, first generation, what they were all interested in was education and culture. And I think that a part of the answer to the alienation and stresses of globalization is to, in fact, utilize that suitcase with cultural experience, if you will, that it will help us to work our way through that disruption and dislocation and build a kind of unity within a civic society.
Anybody else want to comment?
I'd like to just sort of chirp in here. I really very much like what Natalka has said here, this idea that you have these communities that serve as bridges between the old world, the new world, between a type of politics that are tenuous, to be sure, to something that is much more open and democratic. And multiculturalism offers that sort of opportunity of bridge building. But there's a caveat here that I would like to sort of emphasize. And the idea here is that these multicultural communities are only capable of providing that kind of leadership, the roadmap that Natalka speaks of, when they too sort of embrace the civicness of being part of Canadian society. So it's not just simply sort of these communities that are created around their specific cultural identities, but it's also a community that is vested in Canadian society, that embraces democratic ideals, that embraces the kinds of things that are central to a thoroughgoing democratic society. And in this sense, multiculturalism isn't just about cultural community development. It's also about building the institutions that necessarily locate these communities within Canadian society as democratic communities, as organizations that can help address some of the problems that I think that Bill had raised earlier, which is these people come here isolated, they come somewhat alienated. And Meron speaks earlier about how these individuals who come here without a context, we need to provide that context. But the context is not just simply multiculturalism, but it's multiculturalism within a liberal democratic tradition. And here, government has a role to play, supporting those communities in that tradition of liberal democracy, but also acknowledging that it's a cultural context that has to be also supported for that to take place. It's in the interests of the government of Canada, it's in the interests of the people of Canada to ensure that we flourish as a multicultural society, but within a liberal democratic framework.
Thank you.
I strongly support that comment in every respect.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to speak a little to what Vasil talked about. We talk about multiculturalism, And we don't have some of the instruments that would help us really flourish as a multicultural society. And one of the things Bill talked about was about communication and broadcasting. You know, it is something that way back in the day, you know, one of the doomed projects of Ukrainian student multicultural policy was the CBC policy. And the CBC policy was to try and mobilize our national public broadcaster to, in fact, integrate multiculturalism into its broadcasting, to reflect the country as it really was. And we failed at that. But I think that there's a real need within our society for us to speak with each other. And our public broadcaster is a place where we potentially could be speaking with each other. And for me, what I have found quite interesting is the experience of a BBC Channel 4 as a model. And BBC Channel 4 was set up as a channel that reflects minority groups in Britain. And it has been an enormous success. And I think that, you know, one thing that we should think about as a society is, in fact, to think about where we don't speak to each other, and to think about communications with each other. I'm interested in Bill's observations around, you know, communication policy, and whether he thinks that efforts such as the new Ukrainian magazine here in Winnipeg, whether that is filling some of the gap in terms of the new Ukrainians in Winnipeg, and whether he thinks there is you know, whether the digital space is a place where we can, you know, do more of that kind of shared news and shared discussion.
Well, this is a very local issue that you're raising, and certainly, you know, we've seen right across the country the demise of a lot of our media networks. The newspapers that were serving the community, there was more of a TV program, the Contact, et cetera, that was in certain markets. A lot of that shrinkage has taken place, and so there's a problem of communication with people in the communities, interprovincially as well as locally. And locally, yes, a group of new immigrants created a magazine which has been really successful up to COVID. And they stopped circulation because it was a free circulation and in stores. But they really did a tremendous job of bridging all the gaps and doing a wide service. We're going to need to have a network of those sorts of communication vehicles, and they go digital as well. So that would be a solution for a long term. But yes, the answer is yes.
May I just say something about these questions that Bohdan has raised? I think they're crucial. This juxtaposition of democracy versus ethnicity, if you want to put it that way. What you've raised is, I think, a desideratum, an ideal. It's one that we have not quite reached yet, and it's one that's been challenged again and again. It struck me when you were speaking that multiculturalism in Canada came under enormous attack at the very end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, with the rise of the Reform Party in Alberta, and then Conservative government eventually taking over in Ottawa. Simultaneously, in New York and Washington, you have the 9/11 attacks. With the 9/11 attacks, you have a huge backlash against immigrant groups generally, Muslim groups in particular, people from the Middle East, that sort of thing. And you have a sort of a pullback of multiculturalism at that time, if I'm not mistaken. But this is the past, this is not the future. I think we've gone on from that. To some degree, we've recovered from it, but I'm not exactly sure where we are with that now. But more generally, this reflects a debate that was carried on in the 1960s and the late 1960s, just on the eve of of Pierre Trudeau's proclamation of multiculturalism between group rights versus individual rights. And there's a basic contradiction there that people had to deal with at the time. And many people who were opposed to multiculturalism came out in favor of individual rights and against group rights. Now, in my experience, this problem has never really been seriously resolved, and we've still got it with us today. And I think you're sort of heading towards that, but I'm not sure whether you really directly addressed it or not, but you're heading towards it in what you said. And perhaps we could discuss that a little bit more, because I think this lies at the very basis of multicultural theory, and in particular here in Canada, and how it's evolved over the years.
If I could respond to this, I think it is the question. It is this sort of two discourses that appear to be in conflict with each other, this idea of the individual and the community, if you will. I tried to make the case, which I don't think that they're in conflict, and I don't think they're at odds with each other. I think that individuals, as in the case of multiple origin Ukrainian Canadians, they actually see themselves as part of the greater Canadian society as individuals, but they also, treasure and relish their heritage, but it's one that they cherry pick, they pick and choose. The object for the community is to recognize that sort of reality, that the majority of Ukrainian Canadians tend to be sort of multiple origin, a coat of many colors. But at the end of the day, there's also responsibility on the part of the government. And here I want to speak to very briefly to Natalka's comments, which is, the role of government, and sort of Bill's comments, which is we see how the community is responding to integrate some of these newcomers into the fabric of the community, if you will. But there's a role for government to play, and that role for government, sadly, is absent. Whether the CBC as a BBC Channel 4, we have a CBC possibility here. Government chooses not to, but it's very much within the main of what we understand government sort of reaction to cultural pluralism generally from the 1940s onward. They're skeptical. They're skeptical because they see this as a problem in the context of sort of Ottawa's fight with Quebec separatism, and so they don't want to entertain the possibility of even further cultural divisions, if you will. I think that's wrong-headed. I think it's silly. I think that we need to recognize the value and importance of what ethnocultural communities can play in this, not least of which is, as I tried to sort of speak to it earlier, which is a sort of a bridging sort of component. They provide a roadmap for people to become part of this society in a meaningful way, as citizens with rights, but also are part of a cultural community that is relevant, has contributed to this country, and we need to celebrate.
Now, two things. We are a little bit past the hour-and-a-half mark. I'm wondering, Alexander, if we could stay on for another 10 or 15 minutes and take a few more questions. And I should also tell our people who've written in their questions, we've had a flood of them in the last little while in particular, and we obviously won't be able to get to them all. We will, of course, share the questions with all the participants so they can continue with their thinking on it afterwards and maybe respond. But one question, several questions deal with the whole question of Canada's Indigenous peoples. And so I'm going to take one from Natalia Hanenko-Friesen. Going back to the 1970s and 1980s, can you reflect on what place Indigenous people might have seen for themselves, if any, in the debates on multiculturalism back then? There was a mentioning of the Métis people, but what about broader Indigenous participation in these debates? Meron.
Well, I'll go. I'm loving the discussion on today, but I'm a little bit detached, as you can well imagine, because other than reading the press and the CBC, I don't live that life. But in the 70s and the 80s, in the early part of the 80s, the Indigenous communities were not organized. They were at the very beginning of their organizational process at that stage. and they hadn't formulated their ideology or ideologies as communities. So the attempts to speak with them were not leading very far at that stage. They were in the midst of an economic growth or attempts to grow economically. They were dealing with massive social issues, which in many respects they're still dealing with. And I think those issues then were never raised. We were dealing with our issues, and we were dealing, in the case of Manitoba, we were dealing with the French language debate and the Franco-Manitoban community, and seeing where our interests met and where they didn't meet. What I think I'd like to go back to a little bit is when we started seeing the people around us starting to speak about cross-cultural issues, we recognized that that was potentially a threat. And I remember the discussions we had with Yuva State about that stage, but we didn't respond in that way. And one of our failures was then perhaps that we didn't enunciate sufficiently our position, our general vision to the politicians who formulated the policies. We tended to deal on an issue by issue basis. We knew the strategy. They didn't quite understand it, and they didn't understand where everything fit in the long perspective, that we were not looking to separate North Winnipeg from the rest of Canada, for example, taking it to the absurd level, or any other similar issue. That these people were completely confident in their Canadianism. And I think that was an issue. So the indigenous issue started developing when the indigenous peoples started to identify and developing their ideological positions, which was probably in the early 90s already, and setting out where they wanted to go and what the issues were. And perhaps this is, we missed that time at that stage of starting to discuss with them what our joint issues were and how we were to function with them in that position, as we missed the time in dealing with the issue of racism as being the defining issue of multiculturalism. I think those are the questions that we still need to return to in the Canadian context. If I could just return to, because we're touching on how this works in the international sphere, various countries deal with their multicultural situations, and I'm talking about Western Europe and Ukraine in different ways, depending on the threats that they perceive from the minorities or from outside the minorities. And you take Ukraine, for example, we have a very serious threat from Russia on all counts. And one of the major minority communities which are playing up to the Russians. And so, for example, if Ukraine introduced a similar multicultural policy to Canada's, we would have a real problem with the Russian influence on these minority communities. They would move beyond influencing the Hungarian community, moving toward the Bulgarian community, for example, or the Romanian community. And those are that's easily done. A bit of money and away we go. And plus Ukraine is still coming out of this post-colonial kind of society and affirming its own nationality. Now, it's wrong to perceive that affirmation of its own identity as some kind of a right-wing nationalist fascist kind of a thing. In fact, it isn't that in any way. And there was a comment there in the chats about that issue, about those issues, whether it be in the Canadian context or Ukrainian context. It's not. In fact, the far right wing here has very little support. I think 3 or 4%. So, but we need to be aware that the Canadian experience is very unique internationally. We have to talk about that experience virtually entirely in the Canadian context and how we develop it in the Canadian context and how we respond and how we deal with our own new immigrants and integrate them in Canadian society and get them out of Russian or Soviet society and listening to RT and going out to May 9th demonstrations.
Thank you, Meron. I'm just going to throw this one out from Mikhailo Butyrkio. The apology culture, we, in quotation marks, we now find ourselves in with the Liberal government seemingly apologizing to every group it possibly can for the past historical wrongs. The latest apology from the PMO came earlier this week for Italians interned decades ago. Is this a good or a bad thing? And should we emphasize a more forward-looking stance as a community to secure our rights vis-a-vis multiculturalism? This is something that always comes up as this, you know, why is government always apologizing to all these different ethnic groups for, and not just ethnic groups, but for all kinds of things that happened in the past? Is this a good or a bad thing?
If I could, since I've had some experience with the redress movement, it's always a good thing. Confronting injustice is always a good thing. The old cliche, you're bound to repeat it if it's not confronted, stands as a message for generations. That being said, I think that the question has a lot to do with you know, how sincere and genuine is the government. On that question, I'm suspect. My experience in dealing with the government of Canada on the issue of redress, and I speak for you know, a wide assortment of peoples and community organizations that have worked on redress, is that it has been a difficult path, and it largely comes from the, sort of a deep skepticism about cultural communities that are trying to make a case for themselves within Canada and on the basis of their own histories. It's not until that time when that skepticism is eliminated can we have a genuine discussion around such things as racism and discrimination and so on and so forth. But that requires leadership. It really does require leadership at the level of government. And until there is a genuine conversation among the various political parties around this issue, and not simply using it as a kind of measure of one's sort of political success with a portion of the public from moment to moment, will we begin to see real progress in this matter. You know, earlier comment from Natalka Hanenko-Friesen, where she talked about the response of the Ukrainian community to race, to indigenous peoples. Part of that has to do within the wider political context. And that political context is the government itself has failed miserably in dealing with treaty rights and so on and so forth. Until we see leadership at the federal level and the provincial level, will we also see a willingness on the part of a community to respond to leadership. But in the lack of leadership, there is no response. Perhaps maybe this is where we can play a role as a community. And I look forward to that.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on this last point that Bohdan was saying, and I agree with him. But when we're talking about the indigenous issues, let's not kid ourselves. The indigenous population, the First Nations population, and the Métis now, as it's growing steam in this area, are operating in a completely different paradigm. Completely different. I mean, they're a multicultural society unto themselves. You're going to talk about First Nations in BC and the First Nations in Alberta, Saskatchewan, right across Ontario into the Atlantic region. They're a series. They have languages, they have cultures and traditions, and they see themselves, first of all, as a nation equal to Canada, and secondly, within that nation, as a multicultural society within that nation. So now having discussions involving the First Nations isn't simply because the assumptions everybody makes, including us, and we were back in those days and whatever, is that, well, they're a minority. Just like any other minority, they all have, you know, it's a minority problem, we got to deal with minorities. Well, the reality is they never saw themselves that way. And as Meron said, that it took a while for that articulation to happen. But when you take a look at the way things are now and look backwards, that's Thomas's area, looking backwards in history, is they're in a different paradigm. And so the discussion is going to be a complicated one going forward, but we have to understand their paradigm before we try to get into any more, you know, constructive things. They participate with us, we participate then, but the more with them, but the more we interact with them, the more we have to play into and understand their paradigm.
Question came in just recently from Anne Simichuk. Moving forward, what are some specific policies our community leaders should be proposing to address those missed opportunities from the past? Are government policies and approaches to multiculturalism integral to or separate from its focus on diversity? What should it be? Who wants to look at going forward? What instructions do we want to give our community leaders and members of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress who are online in this session, wondering what they can take from our discussions today?
Well, judging from several thousand kilometers away, I would suggest that we need a regular periodic review of our vision, our strategies, and our tactics, much like was initiated in 1985 and developed in 1985, and that needs to guide us in the future. That would be issue number one. It's a very crucial issue that we know where we're headed, the situation we're in, and where we're headed. I don't think that the community addresses the issues that it faces because it doesn't understand the issues that it faces. Not that we didn't make mistakes in the 1985 document, as Bohdan has indicated. And you'll never find a perfect document, but we need to start moving from there. That is issue number one. Issue number two, again, looking from a perspective, we are in danger of having community structures that are led by people that are now at the age where they should be retiring and replaced by a new generation. And that includes me, for example, very much. But I think there needs to be more rapid change in the generations as they take over the community. These should not be sinecures for people to continue working. And I think that again is critical. And it starts when you start looking at what is happening. It reflects on the kind of work that the community does. We're sort of repeating the same issues over and over again. While the importance of focusing on Ukraine is there, and certainly we need to get our politicians to speak to the issues of Ukraine and ensure the Canadian government does certain things for Ukraine, encourage business moving into Ukraine or Ukrainian business moving to Canada. There is a far broader issue for us to deal with in Canada, be it development of dance groups, choirs, language programs. So the question that was raised by somebody in the chats was, I'm a half Ukrainian, where do I find my community? They need to be able to find their community in that sector that they want to be involved in. And that's crucial, that they know, I'm half Ukrainian. Is it enough to wear a vyshyvanka, or is it enough to eat vareniki? Where is my Ukrainian begin and end? Or must I speak Ukrainian? You'd have to say Dobry dень, do побачення. What are the issues? And we need to address those issues in a very meaningful way, where you've got a community where I believe it's now what 5% of the Ukrainian, of those who declare themselves to be Ukrainian, actually speak Ukrainian in Canada. And what is the church going right now? I think it's around 25% of Ukrainians feel that they're members of one of the traditional Ukrainian churches. Well, we're going into that thing, so we have to figure out where it's headed and how it's headed.
We're going to find out more very soon, because of course the census the latest census has just been undertaken, and is going to provide some interesting raw data about Ukrainians and how they identify and where they live. I mean, there are communities now that have sprung up in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, where in Nova Scotia there was always on Cape Breton Island, but places settled by recent immigrants from Ukraine that weren't settled by Ukrainians earlier. So there'll be some very interesting results from that. I think I'm going to just say a few words by way of conclusion, because I said this is a conversation, obviously, that could go on and on, but I think it's very timely when you realize you're talking about how that the community needs to step back and try to understand itself better to figure out where it's going to go forward. That this 50th anniversary, these 50th anniversary of multiculturalism events that the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies has initiated, I hope are contributing to that discussion and will contribute going forward, as is appropriate for an institution that I pointed out at the beginning was very involved in multicultural politics, particularly during the era of Dr. Lupul's directorship and Bhutan Cortana after him as well, and going forward. In conclusion, I would just like to share one or two of my own observations about the issues we were discussing today. I'm struck by the fact that why did Ukrainians play such a prominent role in driving multiculturalism forward? Two things I think worked to do this. One is that you had an established community that still had the original block settlements are still quite influential back then. I mean, there were more Ukrainians living in the countryside then, and there was a greater cohesion in those rural block settlements. And that created a certain Ukrainian Canadian identity and Ukrainian Canadian culture. And so I think that that in combination with the displaced persons who came, they brought something else. They brought an energy and political sort of awareness to the project of multiculturalism. And it was a combination of those two that really drove the Ukrainian community's input into multiculturalism. For the displaced persons in particular, the concern is that the Ukrainian language and culture was under threat in Ukraine. It was also being under threat in Canada through assimilation, and they wanted to do everything they could to preserve the language and culture in Canada for those reasons. And so I think that that's something that always has to be kept in mind. Ukrainians were highly organized, even compared to other ethnic communities, highly motivated and mobilized quickly around the B&B Commission. And so we had a lot of input in it. It's not an accident that Prime Minister Trudeau chose to officially proclaim multiculturalism being adopted as government policy at the Congress, at a banquet at the Congress of the Ukrainian Canadian Committee. Then I happened to be in the banquet hall with him then. I can tell you that the community applauded wildly and gave him a standing ovation because it was a realization of their dreams. What became of that dream is a separate issue. But there's no doubt that multiculturalism as a word entered into broad use not only in Canada, but internationally, and we're associated with the source of that word, multiculturalism. Clearly, multiculturalism as it should be understood in Ukraine or in Western Europe or in other societies, there are huge differences. And I'm hoping that Tom will get a chance in his book to explore some of these issues, and that the community and its conversations going forward will look closely at these issues again and refocus on where it wants to put its energies in terms of evolving multiculturalism to meet the needs of today. So I want to thank all of the people who've joined us online. I want to thank especially our roundtable participants and Tom for their contributions today. It was fascinating. It's going to be really interesting watching these again and pulling things out from the conversations, which, as Alexander mentioned, this will be posted online very shortly. So if you weren't able to catch the whole thing and want to catch the beginning or want to catch it again, or if you know people who might be interested, you can let them know where it's available. And of course, we've got our next one coming up on May 28th, which will be online eventually. And we've got the Reconciling Multiculturalism in Today's Canada conference that's going to take place online, I believe, in 12 to 14 November of this year. And you can find more information about this on the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. So thank you once again, everyone. And Alexander, if you can sign us out, we will say goodbye and enjoy the rest of the day. Dain Vyshivanka.
Bye. Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.